Okay, we're on. Hola a todos, estamos aquí desde Comunidad del Bosque y como sané mi tiroides y hoy tenemos el privilegio de tener a Peter Raine, quien es un nómada del siglo XXI, autor independiente de un libro muy bueno que se llama Vigila a los Guardianes. ¿Quién vigila a los guardianes? Y el chamán et le ecologist. Miriam Lancewood también está con nosotros y ella es a la vez una autora independiente y en estos últimos días creo que ha estado liderando esto que se llama Epic Woman Challenge. Hoy están aquí con nosotros y es un placer estar hablando con ellos desde Nueva Zelanda para toda Latinoamérica y también todo el mundo. Aquí estamos con ellos. Hola Miriam, hola Peter, ¿cómo
Hola.
están?
Good. Thank you very much for having us.
Oh, the pleasure is mine, really. It's been a long time that I have been interested in getting to know you two more, and it's really a pleasure to have you here. Um, So many things happened, and now we have finally the chance to talk. I wonder where should we begin, but I think that the pages or the audience that we're sharing should know just a little bit about your life, your 7 years in the forest. I'm particularly interested on how it all began. I mean, I have seen some other podcasts of you where you talk about where you met Peter and how eventually you all um, made up this decision of going to the forest.
Mhm. Yes.
So,
So I met Peter in South India. This was in 2006, so that's almost more than 13 years ago now. And I was traveling on my own in India, in South India, and I met Peter in a local restaurant. And I was looking for somebody to climb the Himalayas with. And he was also looking for somebody to do exactly that. And we made plans and we did this. We climbed for 2 months over 8 mountain ranges in the Himalayas in India. And after that, we decided to travel overland to New Zealand. So that took another 1.5 years. So we did a lot of traveling together. And when we arrived in New Zealand, I had to work as a teacher because I'm a trained physical education teacher. And I had to work in order to get my residency, New Zealand
okay.
residency. And so we did that for a year. I worked in a year in a school. And in that year, we went every weekend, we went camping and tramping in the mountains. And we said to each other, why can we not stay here in the mountains rather than come back on Monday to go back to work? Because we didn't really need a house and a car and all those things that you can buy with the money that you earn from a job. And we really want to be part of nature rather than just an observer for the weekend and then go back to your house. And so slowly, the idea didn't come in one day like a light switching on. It sort of grew slowly. Yeah, also in the Himalayas in India, we'd seen those sadhus who live quite peacefully with very little in the mountains. And we met them and seen them, and we thought this was a great inspiration to also do this. Yeah, and we've seen that movie Into the Wild, and the guy has a very miserable end. But we thought, can we also do this and go really on living, hunting, and gathering, and trying to survive? And so there's many different elements that made us live in the wilderness, and that all happened in 2010.
Okay. So about this subject, Peter, in particular, do you think that we're lacking? I once heard somebody like Alan Watts said that in previous societies somehow it was some sort of a good thing to allow make it really possible for humans to go out there and experience nature. It was like in some cultures a tradition. Do you think that it's becoming tougher? Like, for example, right now, Miriam said that she had to, even in New Zealand, which is supposed to be like more of an adventurous country and so forth and so on. Do you think it's becoming more difficult in these days to actually go out there and do things like this?
Yes, well, I think it is because there's more and more and more control being exerted over everything through the legal system, and now we have all these new conservation laws. You can do this, you can do that, and you can't do that there, etc., etc., and it's all becoming monetized. So in our case, we decided to go to an areas where nobody else really went because there's certain things that tourists and all those kind of people go for. So we sought out quite remote places where we figured very few people would come to bother us. Um,
Mhm.
and I think, yes, it is harder. Also, life has become so much busier for so many people now, and they're so busy working and so indebted, and they simply don't have the time or the means. And there's also the security issue, is that very few people now are willing to just walk off and not come back. And that's what we've been doing since 2010. And we're still doing it. We just go and do something and we don't think what happens next. And so we don't have a base or a secure place to come back. So one of our ways of doing it is embracing insecurity. And that, of course, is a risk that very few people will take.
Yeah, yeah, I know. Uh, yeah, I think that in these terms, you have to think for yourself to do something like this, and uh, definitely, I think it takes so much courage, but also in a way, uh, I have been able to experience this in certain stages of my life. Of course, not 7 years, but I do now, especially, see the importance, for example, of not having the everyday in one place kind of life.
Mm.
And I think that this is something that, of course, I mean, when you are working in an international company and moving around from city to city, you might think that you're moving, but you are not. You're
Oh,
just visiting the same place, right?
yeah.
Uh, but I don't know how could we actually begin to take sides or to advocate for something like this when we are surrounded by even bigger problems than supposedly this. But as for me in particular, it's been, I mean, one of the reasons why I feel so identified with you two, and uh, trust me, like your video when I shared it with Sarah was one of the most important videos that I ever shared with her, because it's such an amazing thing that I had done in some times, but not in such a long term. But I always had this, I don't know if it's like a rebel craving or something like that, to actually say, hey, uh, why am I not just allowed, or to go somewhere? I mean, I think that there are some alternative communities out there, but it's so scarce. I mean, it's just like a few hundred, spread around the world, and so and yeah, I always question also, in the forest, how sometimes I had to walk in these fences all the time, because there were cattle and people, guarding their ranch and things like this. Do you
Mhm.
at some point grew a little bit of, perhaps, an anti-government feeling, or do you, because I think that you kind of challenged that system when you are sometimes just walking in nature, right?
Yeah, for sure. We challenge it, but not directly, simply because the the problem is so huge that you can spend so much of your energy being concerned with it. And
Yeah.
now there's nearly 8 billion people. On our own, we can't do much. So, do we agree with it? Absolutely, we do not. I find the whole concept of private property and fencing completely offensive, personally offensive. But I'm not prepared to walk through the country and cut the fences because they'll just rebuild them. I think that
Yeah.
one of the solutions to the issue of how to live a wild life is um, is is to be flexible enough to go anywhere and do anything. I mean, if we need to, we can also live in the city, but we still live within the city with our own way. And that's, some people think going in the wild means you just go out in the wilderness and you stay there and you don't come out. But actually, we travel a lot still. We do different things. At the moment, it's winter and we're living very comfortably in a house, but we have no attachment to this, and we have no attachment to living in a tent either. We can adapt to every situation. So adaptation is the power, because the system and all the laws and the regulations are all made for those who are not adaptable. Whereas if you're adaptable, you get around them. You find a way to do things. I mean, we don't break laws that have consequences because it's just not worth paying fines to the police or whatever those
Hmm.
consequences might be. But any rule that has no consequences, well, we don't take any notice of it. In that way, we're anarchists.
Yeah, and also to go back to your first question, we're not really escaping from society actually, because if you escape, then it's sort of a negative frame of mind. But we really wanted to live in the beauty of nature and live very, very far away from other humans and see what happens with the body and mind. And so, yeah, that's quite different from coming from problematic background, such as that
Hmm.
person from Into the Wild and Escape. Yeah, just to add on this.
Hmm.
And do you think that life guided you to this, or do you feel that at some stance you were actually like the creators of this opportunity that you had to live 7 years in the wilderness?
It was definitely a choice, but the choice was simply to see what would happen to the mind if you were living in a natural place without all the disturbances of the human world. What would happen? Would the beauty of nature and its power transform your mind?
And what happened to you, Peter, personally?
Well,
How
that's it.
how
That's the interesting outcome, is that it didn't transform the mind as such, even though obviously you have a lot of time, a lot of peace and quiet out there. But what it did do was it showed how small the mind is, how limited it is, and how enormous the power of life is, and the universe and everything in it. And so rather than expanding, it was simply like a mirror, say, look, you're not very big out here. You're not very important. What happens, what you do or don't do, doesn't influence this vast thing that we call the natural world, or life, if you want to use that word. And that was a startling outcome, because we often get the idea that we're far more important creatures than we actually are in some sense.
Yeah, I recently in the past week I've been having, again, this thought that I've always had in a way, but it's coming back. So it's this one of like, um, do we give purpose to our life, or uh, or why, for example, would we give purpose? And I always compared, like, for example, do animals, live with purpose, or um, do they create their purpose? And how, for example, do you deal with this thing? Because I think that since we were kids, we've been somehow inculcated that we should have, a purpose, that we have a purpose as human beings, for example. How did you see that? I mean, after spending so much time in nature.
Yeah, it's funny. We just spoke about that yesterday. We spoke about the example that we saw a bird, a big Kia, that is a mountain parrot, and they put it in a cage in a town. And those are really intelligent birds. And we looked at the bird in the cage for a long time, and we saw that it was walking up and down and up and down on the same trail so often that it had even created a little trail in the sand. And every time it would look up a little bit, exactly in the same manner. It's absolutely traumatized. And then we compare that bird with the one in the wild. And then,
Yeah.
we make it a bit like humans, but we say that bird in the cage is very unhappy and it wants to be happy. It will sit there
Yeah.
and think, how can I be happy again, right? But the bird in the mountains never has that question. It
What an
never
analogy.
wonders.
That's great. That's a great analogy. Like, yeah, if you're in a cage, maybe your purpose is to, how do I get, grace? How do I get happy or something like
Yeah,
that? When you are
yeah.
just happy, I mean, you're not having that many purposes, right?
No, indeed. So I think if you have the question of what is the meaning of life, you've already lost it, sadly to say.
The other thing, of course, is that so many people these days talk about freedom, but the freedom is the same as the bird in the cage. The parrot doesn't think whether it's free or not because it is. So I think a lot of questions that are coming up in our 21st century, where younger people particularly are asking, what's freedom? How can I be free? Is because people are starting to realize how trapped everyone is within an increasing globalized system where things are controlled by people that you never see, and a lot of the morals and beliefs are made by people who died a long time ago. And so the striving for freedom is because you're caged. So if you can see that you're caged, then you begin to see what the purpose is to get out of the cage.
Yeah, I can say from living also, in like I remember once Miriam said that for her nature was in a way, I mean, we always have, changing minds about this, but she said one time that it was some sort of like a lower vibration. And I have experienced this because I have lived in a way in a farm where I created a food forest around it. And I experienced this lower vibration and this sense of freedom. Nevertheless, perhaps this deep programming of being raised, not, like a regular Catholic, but in a way, it's always like, okay, you have to go for more, you have to go for more. Uh, that in a way, it's a cage that even though you're having the freedom, you're having the time to observe, it's kind of always there bugging you, right?
Yeah.
And now it's not even the question about who is, it's probably not even going to be the question of who is moving the checkboard, which human is doing it. But also, I read in your book, Peter, that you're talking also about AI, and how trapped we can become by ever seducing machines and stuff.
Yeah, indeed. That leads you into a whole different story, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. We don't have
Yeah.
to go there, but I mean, if or not yet.
Yeah, so the prison can come in many different
mm,
forms,
yeah,
technology or the work ethic or
money.
duty, yeah, money, all many different elements.
Mm,
Do you think that there is a line of least resistance? I think that you have contributed already a lot. Like when I saw your first video, I didn't even have the first glimpse, Peter, of what you were thinking. Now, I mean, now that I'm reading your books and your works, I see a lot of things that I didn't saw in the videos, right? But I think that it's very positive just to post a video that shows that could be a way of living. I don't know which would be the line of least resistance to kind of like leave space for people to do that. I think that what you've done is already good enough because it motivates people. Uh, I mean, in my case, it showed me the importance of not living monotonously. Yeah, even if I'm not gonna be living in the wild, uh, it kind of brought me back to the subject of not having this monotonous that I have to stay in one place or something like that. Um,
Yeah, indeed. The whole education system, they give you 50 choices of what you can become. You can become a
Yeah.
teacher or a doctor or, any profession. But they never say, look, you can also live with spending very, very little money, camp outside and don't work at all. They never give you that option. They never
Yeah.
say live in different parts of the world and live in cheaper countries so that your money lasts longer, and none of that. So that's why it's good, I think, that our video would inspire people to also find a different way of living.
Yeah.
Just to add to that, I think that within every single age, there's always been a way for certain individuals to change it. I mean, in Christianity, for instance, you had the whole idea of the hermit who went and lived in the forest. In India, you have the sadhu, the holy man who goes out and lives off very little. And I've certainly lived in countries like India where it was very advantageous for me,
Or
monetary
the
wise.
shaman.
Yes, the shaman's another one. And I think these things exist in every age if you look for them. But of course, they're all different. And so there's no way that you can say, do this way, because then you end up with a religion. But what we're saying is look around and see how you can live more fluidly within the restrictions that you find yourself in and more adaptable, and you'll find your own way out. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have to go and live in the wilderness, although I would suggest it's very useful to do that to get perspective. But you can also live quite randomly within all the other things, and you just approach it differently and find a different way to live within that. Because we're all programmed to live a certain way in suburbia, live a certain way in the city, live a certain way in the country. But there's nothing that says that that's a fact. There is ways around all these things if you look for them, but you have to really look for them. And that's the thing, is that it has to be a very serious inquiry into all this, not just a little one saying, oh, well, I'd like to go and live outside and do something different for a few months. You've got to say, no, I've finished with all this. I'm going to live differently until the day I have to leave. So it's quite a serious thing. It's not a game anymore. And I
It's
think,
a life and death choice in a way, right?
yes, it's like that parrot. If you open the parrot, they open the cage, that intelligent bird's going to go out and it ain't never going to go back in there. And that's the thing, is once you see what you're in, you're never going to go back to it. And then you have to find a different way, whatever that may be, whatever country or culture that you're in, you have to find a different way. I mean, here in New Zealand, we are lucky that we have these big areas of wilderness, but actually we walked for 1,000 kilometres through Europe, and we found there's plenty of space there too. And I
Yeah.
guess there is in Mexico too.
Yeah, in Mexico there is plenty for sure.
Mm.
And also, I mean, in Mexico, I have, we have a very funny paradigm because, for example, the people living near Mexico City, you always hear them talking about the poverties of Chiapas, which is like a more rural area. But I found that in some places of Chiapas, really compared to the misery belts around the big cities, uh, life is indeed, a bit better, at least less stressful. And many people have actually, I'm not the only one that have done something like a food forest project. I think that in a way, these people have their own little food forests around. So there are many ways, and part of there are many ways of reaching a certain freedom, and in a way, Mexico has a possibility also for that. I mean, uh, we weren't a violent country until like 20 years ago, but still, you can go to these places where there is not the big intentions of the North American complex or so, and find, uh, and many people have done it. I hope that you keep in touch with the podcast that we have. We'll be inviting also people that have find their way in Mexico and in Latin America. Um, but yeah, it's quite an issue, right? To be able to set the compass straight and not to just dip your toes into the water, but rather take a really serious and attention approach to this, because it's like once you're out of the cage, it becomes you have to fly. You have to fly. I mean, right now I'm actually, when I talk to Sarah and she's in this stage in which she's I say to her, you have to let people know who you are, or you have to uh, not be afraid of what people are going to say or so, if you have
Yes,
chosen this
indeed.
path.
And I think that's the most difficult thing because in order to get out of the cage and have a totally different life, you have to disappoint the very people you love the most, like your parents and family, friends, because they all have expectations. And then you say of what you should become, right? And then you have to say, no, I'm not doing all that. And that's very difficult, especially if you care about those people. So, right, for
Yeah.
the strangers on the street, they have sort of nameless expectations, but the very people around you. I think that's the most difficult thing.
Yeah, for sure. I have experienced that too. Um, yeah, but at some point I decided also, do I want to live, the life that my parents expect me to have, or my society? I mean, I'm not in a fight with my family, um, but yeah, that part of it is losing the fear
Mm.
uh, of what my family is gonna think if I fail. What if
Yeah.
I fail after I went to a yoga seminar and I said to her, look, to me, you're not gonna be any less if this doesn't work, but I'm pretty sure that it could work, or something would work, and yeah, it's part of the defense, I think, that we build, and yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting once you start sharing what you are, right?
Well, I think you've got it there that fear is the root of it all. I mean, everything works based on fear. And as children, we're encouraged to fear certain things and we grow with that fear. And confronting what fear is actually is one of the most tricky parts of the whole process of freeing yourself from conditioning or programming or whatever you want to call it. Because when you think about it, most of us, and it is most of us, but not all, actually don't have too much to be afraid of. We have no predators anymore. There seems to be in many parts of the world lots of food, and except for those parts caught up in violent conflict, most of us don't have that. And yet we're still afraid all the time, afraid of what we look like, afraid of what we should or should not be doing. And this fear is at the basis of so much conditioned behavior. And it's one of the things, if you go out and you live in the wilderness or you live a random life, you have to deal with it all times because you can't chase it away. You have to actually push through it and keep pushing through it until you see that the fear itself has absolutely no power. It's like fear of fear is what the problem is, not fear
Yeah,
itself.
the double bind, the
Yes,
famous double bind. Yeah,
yes.
for sure. I I think that even, not only this fear of, your close friends, your close circle, which is sometimes, sometimes we speculate that it's, the big state or the Illuminati or the aliens, the one that push more control into us. But I think really that the closer you look, I mean, your closest circle, and sometimes even, our own mind is where we can start.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed. Yeah, the investigation into fear is an important one.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that even, for example, something that I personally have done in the past year is that um, before I've always been kind of able to like form enterprises and things like this, but before I used to, I don't know, probably like avoid the gray areas or the fear zones, or I would like gather sometimes, for example, investors and say everything is gonna be pretty, and things work at some point, but I always felt this need to keep up with the expectations that we were building. And now in a way I'm more into like, okay, let's say out of everything that we can begin, there is a big chance that it's going to fail, but even if it fails, we're having some other way of thinking, like more transparency, into the way the structures are built. Do you think that that could be an approach also that we could, as humans, begin to have another way to organize ourselves in which we don't have to be, you know, um, just looking at the upsides, but looking more at transparency and perhaps honesty into things? Do you think that that could be part of a new era?
Yeah, I think if I understand your question correctly about failure and success, my experience is that it's very subjective. That, for example, I once went midwinter, I went a week on my own deer hunting, and I never saw a deer, and I didn't shoot any deer, but I came back very happy because I shot a goat. And I thought, wow, I've gone out by myself, midwinter, freezing cold, and I got a goat. How fantastic. I completely succeeded. So I think you can turn every experience around into a success. Something you've learned, as what you said, something you learned, or, and in that way you don't feel so miserable.
And another thing I'd like to add there is that if you live a random life like we do, it doesn't always lead to good things. So we've had some really quite difficult experiences out of this by just randomly ending up in situations which some people might say naive, but they weren't really. But the expectation that everything should be good and positive and enlightenment and all that stuff, that's not reality. Sometimes you end up in deep shit, and you have to deal with that as well, and not see that, oh, well, I failed because this happened, or my life is over because that happened, but say, okay, here I've gone through this door and now I'm in this mess. What do I do to get out of it, and not hold on to that or see it as a failure or be bitter about that experience, and just see that as part of the flow of life, because all of us are going to make mistakes. We're all going to get sick. We're all going to do things that lead to difficult outcomes. But that's just part of it. I mean, we noticed that when we lived in the wild, that, say, for animals, things happen to them. Because that's the way life is. And we've evolved this whole ideology that it always should be good and better and perfect and free of suffering. But of course, that's impossible. It's always been impossible and always will be.
Yeah, we're reading a lot from Friedrich Nietzsche, and he is one who says, why always look for security? Why not look for insecurity? Why look for comfort? Why not look for discomfort? And just that reading then, you think, oh yes, this is exactly what I'm doing. We're trained to look for comfort. But if you put that aside and embrace all the negative things as well, then you don't have to be afraid of anything.
Yeah, I have always been captivated by Nietzsche's writing, and there is a very interesting question that that I find out that is perhaps one of my best ones, would be that if you really had, if you don't look at the world, as just the scientific point of view or the mechanical Newtonians or whatever, but once you start looking just a little bit into, like, as a spirit, as a soul or whatever, if you ask yourself one question of having a predictable future, I think I asked myself that question, and I also don't, I wouldn't like to have a fully predictable future, really, either. And I think that's one of the things that you get surprised when you are traveling the way you do, that life surprises you with the goodies, and with the baddies, right?
Yes, I think that's life outside the cage. It's not safe and it's not secure, and you get constantly surprised with reality because it has a habit of throwing challenges at you, right? And
It's a little guru there.
yeah. And so you get the good and the bad, indeed.
Okay, I'm gonna make a little pause. It has been such a pleasure right now to talk these 35 minutes. I'm just gonna make the pause until I load the video on Skype, and then we will keep on talking. Okay?
Yes.